Good morning. I am Edward Males, a master's PhD student from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, where I focus on outer space anthropology, and I'm also a member of the SETI Coast Detection Hub. And while my current work focuses on how frontier mentalities are embodied within American spaceport development, I'm excited to talk to you all today about the many ways we may think about our future in outer space. Specifically, I want to talk about the many complications outer space resources may bring to our current society and the tools we already have to prepare for them. Now, outer space resources gain and retain their value through two main concepts. The first one being resource potential, quite literally a resource's ability to cause positive or negative change within a society or nation. To use a terrestrial example, we can look at oil, which has a massive resource potential, as we've all noticed by the many ways the oil industry has dominated our socio-economic and political realities. The second concept is that of scarcity. And while outer space may be seemingly infinite, the resources we can gain from them are not. And it is because of these two reasons, resource potential and scarcity, which cause outer space resources to be valued so highly, where some asteroids are valued at billions, if not trillions of dollars. And this high value of outer space resources becomes an issue when considering that space mining is subject to relatively little existing policy or governance, despite potentially high stakes. And where the issue of limited governance comes from is a lack of documents dictating how outer space will be ran and regulated, with notable exceptions to the 1967 Outer Space Treaty and the Artemis Accords. However, these can be viewed more as agreements between nation-states rather than an enactable treaty, due to the lack of a regulatory body to enforce adherence to its rules. And the issue of limited outer space governance continues to grow alongside the number of actors who engage in neo-mining, as the 151 signatories of the Outer Space Treaty, or the plethora of private aerospace companies that engage in neo-mining. Outer space becomes a zone of entanglement, where the economic and political landscape of a resource arena is dictated by the interactions between its actors. And as the number of actors continues to grow, so too does the possibility for conflict or resource wars. And resource wars are wars fought over the acquisition or ownership of resources, and can range anywhere from ideological opposition to destruction and extensive loss of life, and usually end up destabilizing political systems. And resource wars are not the only way to destabilize political systems, but are one of the most common. And as political systems are destabilized and fail, there's a need to create new ones. Here we see the four alternative realities of the outer space commons as dictated by the Ares Project or the anthropological research into the imaginaries of and exploration of space. They propose that there are four realities of the outer space commons dependent upon how resources are owned and used. So here we see the space cartel, where one nation, state, or company has a monopoly on all outer space resources. The Earth-centric gold rush, where all outer space resources are used for purely terrestrial processes. The opposite of the open space utopia, where all outer space resources are kept in outer space and used for outer space processes. And finally, the happy middle ground of the Earth space sustainability model, where outer space resources are used both on Earth and in space. And these four realities are tethers, which will allow us to connect them to science fiction and draw possible conclusions from them. And now we get to the fun part, talking about science fiction. But how can science fiction help us to prepare for the future where we do regularly mine asteroids? Well, to borrow one of NASA astronauts' favorite sayings, today's coffee is tomorrow's coffee. In reference to the water filtration system aboard the ISS, where water is continuously reused and recycled for new processes every day, I hope to use science fiction in a very similar way. Through Lisa Musseri's concept of resonance, to make the similar the same, we will be able to analyze science fiction stories in reference to their ability to critique society. And science fiction has always been best used as a method to critique society and make comments about how technologies may affect them. And as the technologies people read about in science fiction became everyday realities, such as the atomic bomb or the television, a feeling of prescience about the genre rose about it, causing it to rise up from mere entertainment within the pulp magazines and become regarded as formal literature. And as it became regarded as formal literature, a positive feedback loop began to develop between the real world and science fiction, where real life affected science fiction stories, and science fiction stories affected real life. And one of the most obvious examples I can think of is how the aesthetics of Star Trek have affected how our phones or communicators look nowadays. And if science fiction can mold our technological development, who is to say it can't help mold our social development? In hopes of answering this, I have created the cosmic frameworks as a method to ethnographically classify and place science fiction stories. And similar to how the fathers of science fiction split the genre into, depending on the ways they wrote about science, whether the hard didactic science or whimsical science, I hope to do a very similar thing. However, I make the split dependent on the types of societies exhibited within science fiction stories. The two cosmic frameworks are cosmic contemporary and cosmic fantasy, where cosmic contemporary stories focus on stories set in contemporary style societies or realities, and often posit a science fiction event occurring in our everyday lives. On the other hand, cosmic fantasy stories posit human interactions in societies as something completely different or alien, and as a result of this, more analysis and extrapolations are needed to derive value from these stories. Now, the science fiction ethnographies we'll be talking about today are the cosmic contemporary story of Space Force and the cosmic fantasy story of Dune. And both of these stories will be analyzed in reference to the alternative reality of the outer space commons that they represent and the various negative outcomes that come about as a result of them. Now, Steve Carell's Space Force focuses on telling us a story through the lens of the newly created military branch and the issues they face when attempting to bring U.S. control to outer space. The story can be viewed as an Earth-centered gold rush, where nation-states compete over outer space resources on the moon and attempts to use them for nation-building on Earth. And it's because of the want to use outer space resources for nation-building that conflict arises between the U.S. and China, where originally China attempted to hinder the American landing on the moon, and later on within the story, both sides, US and China, giving orders to deflate the opposition's lunar habitat and fight upon the surface of the moon. And this shows the many ways in which nation-states are willing to break various agreements of the Outer Space Treaty or other regulations due to the fact that the benefits of outer space resources greatly outweighing the risks of breaking the Outer Space Treaty due to the lack of a regulatory body to give them punishments. So this cosmic contemporary story does a fantastic job at showing the various ways nations may come to conflict with another through resource wars, even willing as to go as far as breaking pre-existing treaties or agreements which guarantee space as being for all humankind. Now, another science fiction story, which does a fantastic job at displaying how a lack of a regulatory body will lead to political destabilization, is the Dune series. Now, within the Dune series, the zone of entanglement has a multiplicity of actors, such as the houses Major and Minor, which represent a feudal-like society, which is why I posited it as cosmic fantasy, as well as the Bene Gesserit or the Spacing Guild, which are all in competition over the limited good that is spice, which only grows on the planet of Arrakis. And the use of spice is somewhat regulated by what they call the Great Convention. The Great Convention can be seen as their version of the Outer Space Treaty. However, the Outer Space Treaty, being dependent upon being for the benefit of all humankind, the Great Convention is predicated upon ideals of mutual destruction. And through this analogy, we can use jump using cosmic fantasy towards Cold War analogies. And through Cold War resource anthropology, we can view how many European colonies within Russia failed and defected from their European colonizers, took control of their resources, and then, defected and took control of their own power. Now this is paralleled within the Dune series of how the Fremen rose up alongside their Messiah, taking control of the outer space resource known as spice. In doing so, Paul Atreides, the main protagonist, and his Fremen have created a space cartel, where all other actors in this zone of entanglement are withheld to the whims and wishes of their new emperor. And as a result of this, the delicate equilibrium which held their society in contact fails and ultimately crumbles. And through this lens, we can see how a space cartel has the ability to destabilize political systems and throw us into mass turmoil, even if it was done with positive influences. Now, overall, I hope that I've shown the validity in using science fiction as predictive models for outer space theory and policy creation, and that the plethora of stories we have at our fingertips can be used as tomorrow's coffee. And we're not beholden to just using this for resource anthropology, but we can use it for governance, citizenship, how we may interact with potential alien life, and so much more. So, I hope I've given you all some food for thought in the many ways which science fiction can help us think about the future. And to borrow an ending from my favorite piece of science fiction, so long, Space Cowboy.